Hi guys, this is a review for Unit 2, so I wanted to make sure that you guys have your notes first, so you can start adding the information to the information that we're going to review right now. So it only has 7 subsections, it's very easy, and we're just going to start with basic definitions such as biodiversity and the types of biodiversity. So biodiversity is going to represent the diversity of life, right, in the world. So biodiversity is going to have 3 subtypes. It's going to have genetic, species, and ecosystem or habitat biodiversity. We're also going to talk about what is keystone species and what is the value of biodiversity and the conservation. That conservation part, make sure it's on your notes. It's not on the video. So just make sure you check the laws that protect the conservation of biodiversity. And what happens if we lose the biodiversity? So what happens if we have habitat loss or invasive species, climate change, pollutions, over-harvesting are some of the problems for biodiversity. Okay, it's a HIPCO kind of shortcut that we decided to use for that. So I'm going to remind you of that in a moment. Okay, so more variation, it's important. It's good to have biodiversity because more variation means that organisms or an ecosystem can withstand any kind of stressors that will come into that area at a certain time. Like, for example, a disease, a plague. If we wouldn't have enough biodiversity, you can apply this to any type of organisms. You can apply to humans right now with the COVID-19, for example. So all of those are environmental stressors. And because we have different variation, we do have people that are recovering for the COVID-19. Now, there are 3 types of biodiversity, as I said. The genetic diversity is going to be the genetic variation among the individuals in the population. So let's look at this picture over here. So genetic variation, if we would have a different fur color for mice, such as the allele fur color and the black fur color, it would give us a different ratio when we mix it, depending on if they are homozygous or heterozygous. So having that variation on the genetic pool will allow this population to withstand any environmental stressor or more environmental stressor than if we would have only an homozygous allele. So the next one is species diversity. So species diversity is going to be the number of species in a region in a particular type of habitat, and that is known as the species richness. So the number of species, if I have 5 different species, if I can count how many species do I have in this coral reef, I would say this is the number of species, which is the same as saying species richness. That's usually a question on the exam. What is a species richness? So the higher the number, the higher the species richness number is going to be, the more productive that environment is, and the more resilient it is. And we're going to talk about what is resilience, right? Which is overcoming change, not necessarily resisting change, and better able to recover from a disturbance. Now, the last type of diversity is ecosystem. According to the AP, to the CED, is known as habitat biodiversity, but most of the books name it as ecosystem diversity. So make sure you know both of them. So the ecosystem diversity, we covered it in Unit 1, which would be our biomes, right? The different habitats that we have in a different region because of altitude, latitude, climate, temperature, and so on. So the greater the number, the healthier that environment is. Okay, so then we have what is a population bottleneck. We talked about these definitions. So the picture might look similar to something that you've seen before. So a population bottleneck is going to be an event that kills most of a population, such as a natural disaster. It will reduce the genetic diversity. So it could be applied to any population. So any kind of disease, for example, or natural disaster will reduce the genetic diversity. So we could say if a natural disaster hits a specific area, so let's say it hits, a South American country or a Central American country, so the number of individuals that remain will probably not have enough, or they would have less genetic diversity than all the people that were represented with all the different alleles before the natural disaster. So that is population bottleneck. So selectively, that genetic diversity has decreased because of that event. Now, There are environmental stressors. So on the first slide, I asked you, or I said, there are different environmental stressors such as disease, right? So there are other environmental stressors. So which ones are environmental stressors? I need to know which ones. So climatic, example, any type of temperature that is out of the normal for that specific place. So if I talk about extreme temperatures in let's say the tropical rainforest will be different than extreme temperatures in the tundra, for example. The amount of solar radiation that they receive, that would be an environmental stressor. If we're in the tropical rainforest, remember that all the floor plants will have as an environmental stressor the less amount of solar radiation. The amount of wind, the amount of moisture available as well, depending on competition of different species. Now, the chemical environmental stressors will be, for example, the type of chemicals that will represent the nutrients on the soil. So we could say like the amount of phosphates or the amount of nitrates, those would be availability of those nutrients would represent chemical stressors. Toxicity levels as well. If there is a mercury pollution in a lake, then we would have a toxicity level different than what those organisms can withstand. Therefore, that becomes a stressor. I think you get the idea. Okay, so wildfires as well. Physical stressors involve anything like natural disasters, right? Anything that physically is affecting that area. So if we could say, for example, deforestation would be a physical environmental stressor. Okay, biological environmental stressor would be some relationships that we are already seeing, like predation, parasitism, competition for moisture, space, maze, or whatever. Okay, now, because we are changing the habitat of species, that loss of habitat is reducing the amount of specialist species. Now, you know, specialist species are like the picky one, right? They have a narrow niche. They are less adaptable because they have a very specialized niche. So if you look at these two species over here, they are a specialist because they are only adapted to one type of diet. They are only adapted to one type of habitat, or they only use this amount of resources specific to a certain place or a certain island, right? So those would be the specialists. And then if I continue, right, affecting the habitat, I can affect even the generalist. So it says followed by a loss of generalist species. So generalist species also can get lost if I continue affecting the habitat. So that will reduce the number of species that I have in that ecosystem because I don't have enough space for all the different species to fulfill their niche. Example, another specialist species is the tiger salamander. So the tiger salamander, I don't have a picture, but the tiger salamander cannot reproduce unless they live on wetlands. And we've talked about wetlands and the problems that we have with wetlands, and that, you know, if they don't live in wetlands, they have to live in wetlands year-round. Now, not all wetlands are wetlands year-round. So they need to be on wetlands that don't dry out throughout the spring or the summer. They need to have a lot of insects around and worms for their diet. So if that changes, that will affect the population of tiger salamanders, for example. Now, because of the different habitat locations, as we saw, habitat diversity, we're going to have the different species richness. So I took an example like the bird species richness in the United States is going to decrease as you go north because we're changing our biomes, right? We're changing our habitat. So the biodiversity for birds will decrease in a way. Now, I talked to you about species richness, which is the number of species present on an ecosystem. So species richness, for example, if we looked at this forest over here, we're going to have that there are four types of trees. So this community is going to have four as a species richness, and this community is also going to have four because it also has four different type of species of trees. However, the species evenness for community 2, right, is going to be different than the species evenness for community 1. So I would like in my community to have more species evenness or a better ratio, right? So I do not have enough representation of species 1 on community 2. Therefore, the species even is not as even, right, as community one. So I need to know what is the species richness. They can have the same species richness, but they have different species evenness. And the better the evenness of a community, the better ability for survival and the more biodiversity that it will represent or that it would have. Okay, 2.2 ecosystem services. So we need to know these two definitions first. The ecosystem values are based on an intrinsic value and an instrumental value. So the intrinsic value is going to have, it's just going to be the own value of an ecosystem, regardless of why do I use it for. So there is a plant that exists in the middle of the forest in Central America because it needs to be there, right? It doesn't matter if it helps me on my needs, on my health, on my any kind of use that I could give to that tree in the middle of the forest. So that is the intrinsic value of any species, of any living organism, right? In terms of where is it located. So all of those ecosystems, they have their own value because they exist, because they are living things. Now, instrumental is because it has worth in terms of good of services. So the other value of an ecosystem is instrumental because it's going to provide some kind of good of service for humans. Okay, I'm not going to go through every single one of these. These are the same thing, but I wanted you to have, I know you already have a chart for all the ecosystem services. There are 4 types. You know that the base ones are the support services or the supporting services. So those supporting services, which are, like the biogeochemical cycles, they're going to be supporting all the ecosystem and all the other services as well. I just wanted you to remember that. So if you can pause this and go through every type of ecosystem service, it would tell you what examples you would have. And of course, the better the notes you have, the more chance that you have to answer a question correctly. Just remember what a provisioning service, right? Products obtained, the definitions, what a regulating service, like benefits from regulating the ecosystem, the cultural services, and then the supporting services just to support the ecosystem itself. Okay, that was 2.2. 2.3, island biogeography. We also talked about island biogeography, and we had a case study that we studied at the beginning of the year. But the island biogeography example is going to study the ecological relationships and the distribution of organisms on islands, and these organisms and how they interact with one another. So the number of species found in an undisturbed environment is going to be determined by the immigration and extinction. So they will be determined also by the distance from the mainland and the size of the new habitat. So remember, we have the mainland and we have the little islands, and then we see how many species are able to migrate. So if we have an island closer to the mainland, that, let's say, bird is going to probably migrate closer to the closer island than to the further island. Therefore, we would have a more chance of finding that species closer to the mainland. So there are different factors, right? So we're going to have the proximity to the mainland. So if it's closer to the mainland, right? Or if it's far from the mainland. So closer to the mainland, many species large nearby the island, right? To the large nearby island. Now, if the island is bigger also, there is more chance that the bird will, let's say, see the island in order to locate itself in that new island. So there are 2 factors that affect the distance and the size of the island to determine where the species is going to go, right? So small islands and large islands. So we're going to increase faster species richness in large islands because there is more size, more space for interacting than in a small island. We're also going to have a higher species richness sooner than from the mainland because there is less of a chance that the species make it to the farther island. Now, islands have been colonized because of new species arriving in different ways. Many species have evolved in that islands to be a specialist. So that means they have adapted to the resources that are located on the island. Okay, now what happens is specialists, they have become only kind of like used to a type of resources. Now, if I have some generalists that arrive on the island and they would overcome the specialist species on the island because they can just take on any kind of resource. They can survive on any kind of resource, they can stand any kind of temperature, they can eat whatever is available. So they will have a greater niche, right? They have a narrow niche. So if generalists arrive into an island in which specialists are like already inhabit that island, then generalists will overtake the specialists, risking the population of specialists. Now, this form of generalists will be invasive species. Now, remember that invasive species are a type of generalist species. So not all generalist species are invasive. However, invasive species are known as to be generalist species. So if invasive species take over any kind of location, any kind of habitat, they will endanger the specialist species. They will endanger even keystone species, which we'll talk in a little bit. So it's important that we recognize the damage or the consequence of introducing invasive species because they will outcompete the specialist species. Okay, ecological tolerance. So for ecological tolerance, we have seen that in the previous unit 8 before the break. So the ecological tolerance is going to be the range of conditions, abiotic factors like temperature, salinity, flow rate, sunlight, that an organism can endure before injury or death. It can be applied to individuals and species. So these population of organisms, right, is going to have a certain range of tolerance for specific abiotic factors. So the range of tolerance can be different for pH, for temperature, for any kind of abiotic factors is going to be different. And each species will have a different tolerance range. So I want that group of species to have an optimum range, right, in which they thrive. They can have a tolerant range because they can withstand some stressors, right? Some changes into that abiotic factor. And then the zone of intolerance will have the species not thriving, dying, because there is no available niche for them to fulfill. Examples of abiotic factors: pH, temperature, salinity, and so on. Now, there are some species that change that tolerant range because of their cycle. So we have, for example, the salmon cycle is going to take into different levels of salinity depending on the stage in life that they are in. So that's an exception. Okay, limiting factors. Limiting factors are the factors that are in short supply that will regulate population growth. So factors in short supply that regulate population growth. In the soil is usually going to be nitrogen or phosphorus or potassium. So that's why when I create a fertilizer, right, we're going to have fertilizers are known as NPK fertilizers. So there's also these testing kits that are called NPK because they will test what level of nutrients we have. Now, the next one is going to be the open ocean. In the open ocean, the limiting factor could be nitrogen, silica, iron, or dissolved oxygen as well. In fresh water places, we have phosphorus. So phosphorus, it's actually considered by the AP as the main cause of eutrophication. So I could lack phosphorus, but what would be the opposite, right? If I do have enough, if I have a lot of phosphorus, then I would have eutrophication. In basin estuaries would be salinity. So the question over here, it says, if a limiting factor or limiting nutrient is the only thing holding back, in this case, an algae population, so let's say on a lake, right, an algae population, what happens when a lot of that limiting factor is added? If it's talking about algae, what would the answer be? An algal bloom, right? Okay, so natural disruptions to ecosystem. Okay, so the two definitions that we needed to have are resistance and resilience. So resistance is going to be against the ability to hold on, the ability to resist, the ability to not move, to restrain, to be static, to not change, right, to a disturbance. Resilience, though, is going to actually go with the movement, is going to let it go, it's going to be dynamic, and it will promote adaptation and growth. So for example, if the disturbance is a fire, resistance would be, I can withstand that and it's not going to burn me and I'm going to be fine. resiliencies as an ecosystem, right? All of that ecosystem, all of that habitat will get burned, right? It will get burned, and then it will regrow, right? Like in succession. So it will regrow, and then it will go back up. It could be in a different format with different trees, but it still has the ability to be resilient, to adapt to that change, and so on. Natural disruptors are weather, geological forces, biological changes, and fires. And human disruptors, this is the hippo that I was talking to you about, but this hippo is missing that C over here, which should be climate change. But everything else, hippo over here, those are the human disruption types. There are other human disruptions that have been added to this hippo shortcut, like diseases, for example. So I also put that one just in case. Okay, so the Earth system processes operate in a range of scales in terms of time. Processes can be periodic, and this is part of the CD, so make sure you know this. Okay, so the processes can be periodic or occur in irregular intervals, right? Any kind of processes, like let's say biogeochemical cycles, or maybe even seasons. Episodic, a series of loosely connected events, right? If we talked about hurricanes, or it could be just random. So the Earth's climate has changed over geological time for many reasons, because of the orbit, the tilt, the solar energy, and the greenhouse gases. The sea level has varied significantly because of the result of changes in the glacial ice on the Earth over geological times. We can observe here, and we talked about this interglacial time and how this one is actually connected to the amount of carbon dioxide and the greenhouse gases and all that. And the major environmental changes or upheaval commonly results in large changes of habitat. So the wildlife also engages in both in short and long-term migration, depending on temperature, depending on seasons. So it also includes natural disasters. But almost there. 2.6, adaptations. So natural selection says that there must be a variation in order for that species survival. So that variation is shown as a mutation. Now, mutation doesn't represent a bad thing. The mutation produces different alleles on species. There are 4 requirements for natural selection, and each one says, I need to produce more offspring, so I would have a better chance to be selected, right? Genetic variation means in my DNA, we already saw it, I do have different alleles that, therefore, I do have a higher genetic variation. The struggle for survival means that those adaptations from my traits would allow me to survive, will give me a better chance of survival if I am facing, an environmental stressor. And the differential reproduction are the organisms with the best adaptations will be the most likely to survive. So if I have traits that are naturally selected, then I will have a better chance to survive. Example, if we have a land that is a brown coloration in between brown and green beetles, then the brown beetles have a better chance for survival than the green beetles. However, if the habitat changes coloration, then that will be the opposite. These over here are the same as these over here, just letting you know how you can match one of these with one of these. Then we also need to know what a speciation is. So speciation would be the members of a species cannot have babies together anymore if a new species have been produced, right? So a species, we need to define now what is species, right? We have heard so many times that from some kind of cat in the past, we have all the different cats that we know now. Okay, so speciation, again, formation of a species, right? A species is, what is a species? If I want to define a species, is an organism type that is able to have babies that can reproduce. So there are 2 types of speciation. We have allopatric and sympatric. There are 4 types, but we're only going to focus on 2 types. The allopatric speciation happens because of some geographical isolation that has formed, thus they become so different that they cannot interbreed anymore. Sympatric is without having any geographic isolation. For some reason, something happened here, like lack of nutrients in this area of the soil, or less sunlight, or more sunlight, or less water floating, whatever, that would allow sympatric speciation to happen. So the environmental changes might threaten the species survival, requiring individuals to alter behaviors, move, or perish. So we are altering them. And the last one, ecological succession. There are 2 types of succession. So we have primary on the top and we have secondary on the bottom. We have this one starts from bare rock, right? And you can go from bare rock to pioneer species. These are the only pioneer species that can start. And then it will change into more adapted and more specialized species. However, after a disturbance, right, we have a climax community. It starts after a disturbance that we will start with some kind of soil that remains. And soil and bare rock are different because this one will have nutrients, right? And so on. Now, these are the differences in between primary and secondary. What is a pioneer species? I need to know examples. These are the only two examples of pioneer species. And then what is an indicator species? So there are different charts, such as this one, in which the presence of, let's say, dragonfly nymph will allow me to know what is the pollution level of a lake. So if it's a low, if they are in high quantities or not, that will determine as an indicator species what is the pollution level of that lake. And that's it.